to Exodus 20, to the 3 verses we read that cover the next commandment. Who or what do I love the most? It says you shall have. You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above or on earth beneath or in the waters below. You can think, well, no idols? Well, that's an easy one ticked off. I'm not tempted to make carved idols, carved images of God. Now, last time when we looked at the first commandment that prohibited worshipping false gods, and we come to this one, it's more than just not making idols. It's about not worshipping the true God in inappropriate ways as well, or of giving affection to someone or some things that's taking God's place in our lives. Now, there have been debates in the early church, particularly in Eastern Christianity, about the use of icons in church, images of saints and others from the past, which have not been seen as images of God. But it's been a debate that's caused issues in the early church in Eastern Christianity. But Augustine, the great 4th century Algerian Christian leader, said that there's a God-shaped hole in every human heart. There's that desire to worship someone or something that people are yearning to fill with something. No one has nothing on which they place their affections, that they focus on as the priority in their lives. John Peyton, a great missionary from Scotland, who worked particularly in the New Hebrides, but also spent a time in Australia with the Aboriginal peoples. He was disturbed as to how they were viewed by some others in Australia who didn't see them as being capable of relating to God in the way others did, which is really a really troubling viewpoint. But he vindicated that by his building friendships with Aboriginal people, and he mentions in one of his books about a particular Aboriginal friend who talked about their beliefs. And Peyton came to the conclusion that there's no people, when their language and customs are rightly interpreted, it doesn't have that consciousness of a need of God and that desire to hold fellowship with the divine. So what's this commandment actually saying to us? What's the purpose of the law? What's the rule from God? People in the ancient world generally believed that by producing carved representations of their God, that they were bringing themselves closer to the God they were praying to. Most of the time, they didn't actually believe that carved object was their God. But so easily the two could be confused. Amongst the Israelites in the Holy Land, the Canaanite peoples of the Old Testament era had their Baals, different ones for different territories and different areas of life. But God wanted his people to be different. It wasn't a ban on religious art or creativity. The tabernacle was decorated and cared for. And in the book of Exodus, the later chapters, the commendation of 2 craftsmen who headed up the creative work in the temple and the making of the garments worn by the priests who were on duty, headed up by Aaron, Moses' brother. But it was a focus on God rightly in worship. The God, the Creator, is different and distinct from his creation. Isaiah 57:15. This is what the high and lofty one says. He who lives forever, whose name is holy. I live in a high and holy place, but also with him who's contrite and lowly in spirit, to revive the spirits of the lowly and to revive the hearts of the contrite. God's big concern was that their view of him was right. The majestic God, but yet one who also sought to draw close to us, that we know, of course, supremely revealed through Jesus. But the response of humanity, well, as you read the Old Testament story, it could be a bit depressing at times. The prophets continually had to challenge them on this subject. Isaiah 40, verses 18 to 20. To whom then will you compare God? What image will you compare him to as an idol? A craftsman cast it, and a goldsmith overlays it with gold and fashions silver chains for it. A man too poor to present such an offering selects wood that will not rot. He looks for a skilled craftsman to set up an idol that will not topple. And in more detail in Isaiah 44, the passage that we read earlier, again the description of the folly of idolatry. And the very poignant image later in Isaiah when Babylon fell, of the big images of Bel and Nebo, the gods of Babylon, being taken on horseback, and the carts being taken to Persia as war spoils. Very few of the rulers in the ancient world attempted to worship just one God outside of Israel. One of the pharaohs, Amenhotep IV, who ruled around 1336 BC, sought to worship just one God in Egypt. It caused a lot of grumbling because of all the temples and all the priests are employed, and they went back to the traditional patterns after his rule. But in Israel, it was a constant battle as you go through the Old Testament, but there were priests, there were prophets, and rulers like Josiah and Hezekiah, who trusted God and sought to bring the people back to him. But the temptations of idolatry, not always physical, to create images to represent God as they did, like after the giving of the Ten Commandments, when Aaron, under pressure from others, made a calf to represent God when Moses was delayed on the mountain. But that's not normally an issue for people today. It's an issue back then, so we can think it's not likely to be an issue for us. So it seems a very different world to see the images of people like King Jeroboam, the one who broke away from Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, who ruled over the United Kingdom nearly 3,000 years ago, who set up images of calves to represent God in two places in the northern kingdom, Israel. So what's the kind of issues for us? Well, we can turn to the New Testament. Jesus, in John chapter 4, met with a woman in Samaria. He's asking about her life, and things are getting a little bit uncomfortable. And so she raises some religious questions. Where should we worship? We've got our place of worship here in Samaria. You Jews have got a temple in Jerusalem. Which is the place we should worship? Where's the real place? But Jesus said, no, that's not the issue. Worshipping the Father in spirit and in truth. Buildings are important. They have their place. And buildings can be precious to us. A place of a baptism, a place of a marriage, a place of some other family memories of worship and so on. But at the heart, it's the person we worship in spirit and in truth. So what's the relevance for us today of this commandment? Can I say these things? God gives purpose and meaning and fulfillment to my life. Can I say God governs the choices I make in my life? Can I say God is the central focus of my way of life? That God's often in my thoughts and I can get enthusiastic when I think about him. God's words, his promises comfort and encourage me when I'm feeling down. God comes up in my conversations with other people, especially with others that are following him. And I desire to be more like him and to follow him more closely. If you replaced God with your career, a hobby, some possessions, a sport, music, for others, sex or relationships or something else, does these other things have a higher focus, a greater attraction in our lives than following the Lord? It's more subtle than we can often imagine. Does God have his rightful place in our lives? So what kind of inappropriate images or places of affection might people have today? Just to pick out a few. There are people that can focus on money and wealth, that they have to have more. If that's where we place our affections, it's a cruel taskmaster, because people always want a little bit more to make them happy. And that even goes, even some of the millionaires and billionaires, from what I've read. Just a little bit more, but it's never going to be enough. And that can lead people into real troubles with debt, chasing a lifestyle they can never have, because it's never going to be possible. There are the people for whom that focus is about the human body. In our culture, the unhealthy images in advertising. People think, I'd only be happy if I could look like this person. But the tragedy is, so often some of these images in the magazines or in social media, they're not even the real images of that person. It's so easy, if you've not the technology, to even doctor those. And the tragedy in our society of people placing their hopes in their physical appearance. The problems with anorexia or bulimia or other issues. It's tragic when that has too high a place. What about power? There are people sometimes, yes, in politics, but also in other places, who want to get power, get positions. But when they get there, they don't actually know what to do with it. And we've all seen that in politics. And it maybe happens in some workplaces where people get promotions but aren't able to do the job effectively. We thank God for people in the Bible, like Daniel, the Prime Minister of extraordinary longevity in the Babylonian and Persian empires, or Esther in the royal family in Persia. Two examples of people who kept their focus on God in an exalted public office. There are other people for whom sex or relationships can be the issue that they focus on, to the exclusion of other things. Some living their lives through characters in their favourite soaps, but others, an endless stream of relationships, hoping to find the right person eventually. But for others who distort their images of relationships through pornography, which is a growing problem in our land. What kind of idols do we have that we need to address? If that's an issue for somebody today. For other people, it can be fame. There's all kinds of shows that people can get on. And yes, they can be fun. But for some people, wanting to have their moment of fame and get distressed when it goes. Fame doesn't last, as we know. So what kind of idolatry could be a problem in more ordinary life? Let's take the workplace. Your security in so many jobs. Nowadays, they're not permanent. They're not guaranteed for life. Where do we place our security and our identity? I've been able to come to terms with things where we don't have full control over our career or our work. What happens when redundancy occurs, which does happen? What about significance? When we think about our lives, or we're asked by someone to talk about themselves. Of course, for many of us in the Western world, we mention our work. It's natural. For many of us, it's a big part of our lives, and rightly so, we can be proud of what we seek to do. But the significance of our lives has to be more than the work we do. Where's the significance of your life found? Some companies, like the first company I worked for after university, had an unhealthy view of the place of the company in people's lives. I've mentioned that before. I mentioned the company actually had a hymn book. You sang hymns to the praise of the company on a Monday morning. Yes, and Francois, I was mentioning it at the Deacons Away Day on Saturday, and Francois actually found an old edition from an American edition of it. Yeah, it's cringeworthy. I did say yesterday that if my ethical standards hadn't been higher, I would have actually taken one of the British branch of the company after I left. Because it's hard to believe that people would actually do that, but that was required. And Father Abraham was the one that was a guaranteed banker on Monday morning if sales figures had not been good the week before. Imagine 30 people in the office in suits singing Father Abraham more than once. It was meant as a punishment. In a completely non-religious context. The company and its ethos was out of place. It was wrong. Yeah, there's elements of humour. I was only there a short time. But some people actually took it seriously. There's issues of control in workplaces, of people who it's the power issue of misusing that to favour themselves or others inappropriately. John, at the end of his first letter, says, "Dear children, keep yourself from idols." The idols cheat us from the freedom and fulfillment that God wants each of us to have in life, whether single or married, young or old, waged or unwaged. To have things out of focus and our priorities in the wrong place distorts our lives. Sometimes those pressures are understandable. But the commandment's aim is to enable us to give God the first place in our lives. And then that will enable us to get everything else in its rightful place. That we value and treat appropriately the people with whom we relate, in our families, in our workplace, in our communities. That our view of the things we possess is also viewed in a right and healthy way. Jesus said the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy, but I've come that you may have life, and life in all its fullness. So our questions for reflection: who or what do I love the most? And secondly, in what area of my life do I struggle the most to honour God in my choices? Let's take a few moments to reflect on these questions.